Night of March 28th to 29th, 1941, in the Ionian Sea south of Cape Matapan, at the southern tip of Greece's Peloponnese Peninsula. Three British battleships, close to within 3,800 yards of two Italian heavy cruisers in pitch darkness, point-blank range for 15-inch guns, and without warning snap open a dozen searchlights and open fire. At the head of the British line stands HMS Warspite, 26 years old, a veteran of Jutland in 1916, and roughly 6 knots slower than the modern Italian battleship she had spent the entire afternoon failing to catch. What happens in the next few minutes will be remembered as one of the most one-sided actions in the history of naval gunnery. Within less than 10 minutes, 2 Italian heavy cruisers and a destroyer are reduced to blazing wrecks for the loss across the entire 3-day battle of a single British aircraft. By March 1941, the naval war in the Mediterranean had reached a critical juncture. British convoys were ferrying troops and equipment to Greece ahead of an expected German invasion of the Balkans, and Berlin pressed Rome to use the Italian battle fleet to cut that traffic. The German air formation based in Sicily, Fliegerkorps 10, promised air cover for any Italian sortie against the convoy routes, a promise that would prove far less reliable once the Italian ships were actually at sea and exposed. On March 27th, Admiral Angelo Iacchino sortied from Naples with the battleship Vittorio Veneto, the heavy cruisers Zara, Fiume, and Pola of the 1st Cruiser Division under Rear Admiral Carlo Cataneo, further cruiser squadrons, and a strong destroyer screen, intending to intercept British shipping south of Crete. British codebreakers had already read enough of the Italian signal traffic to give Admiral Sir Andrew Cunningham, Commander-in-Chief of the Mediterranean Fleet, advance warning. Cunningham sailed to meet the threat with his own battleships, HMS Warspite, Valiant, and Barham, the aircraft carrier, HMS Formidable, and a cruiser squadron under Vice Admiral Henry Pridham Whipple, comprising HMS Orion, Ajax, Gloucester, and the Australian cruiser HMAS Perth. On paper, the two fleets were not evenly matched, and not in Britain's favour. Warspite, Valiant, and Barham were Queen Elizabeth-class battleships, laid down before the First World War. Even after extensive interwar reconstruction, Warspite's top speed topped out at roughly 24 knots. The Vittorio Veneto, commissioned barely a year earlier, could make 30 knots at sea and had exceeded 31 on trials. A 6-knot gap meant that, in a straight chase, the newer Italian ship could simply outrun the British battle line at will. And during the afternoon of March 28th, after British carrier aircraft first attacked her, that is exactly what she did. Prevailing naval doctrine of the period also treated close-range night actions between heavy ships as something to be avoided wherever possible. Identification in darkness was unreliable. The risk of engaging one's own side was real, and no major navy had fought a decisive night battleship action of this kind in living memory. Closing on an undetected enemy in the dark and opening fire at pistol-shot range was, by the standards of 1941, closer to gambling than doctrine. Warspite herself carried the scars of the last age of battleship gunnery. At Jutland in May 1916, she had been struck by at least 13 heavy German shells, one of which jammed her steering gear and sent her spinning twice through uncontrolled circles directly under the guns of the German battle fleet, before she regained control and limped home for months of repair. By 1941, She was one of the oldest capital ships still serving in the front line of any major navy, a fact her own crew were well aware of. To reach the Italian fleet at all, Cunningham first had to convince Italian intelligence that his own force was staying in port. On the afternoon of March 27th, he arrived at the Alexandria Golf Club with an overnight bag, played a round in full view of the Japanese consul, a suspected conduit for Italian intelligence, and let word circulate that a party would be held aboard Warspite that evening. The party never happened. Cunningham slipped ashore after dark and sailed with the fleet, rendezvousing with Pridham Whipple's cruisers south of Crete on the morning of the 28th. The technical edge that would make the coming night action possible had also just reached the fleet. HMS Valiant carried one of the first sets of Type 279 radar fitted to a Mediterranean fleet warship, a system largely untested in combat and viewed by much of the Admiralty as a curiosity rather than a war-winning tool. The Italian ships carried no radar of any kind, and per their own pre-war doctrine, were not equipped or drilled to fight a gun action after dark at all. When the moment came, their main gun turrets were not even trained ready for action. The battle opened in daylight. Shortly after 8 o'clock on March 28th, Italian cruisers sighted Pridham Whipple's squadron near the island of Gavdos and opened a long-range gunnery duel. Heavily outgunned, the British cruisers fell back toward Cunningham's battle fleet, drawing their pursuers into range of Formidable's aircraft. Vittorio Veneto herself then appeared over the horizon at around 10:55 and opened fire on the retreating British cruisers, forcing them to run for cover under a smokescreen until repeated air attacks from Formidable persuaded Iachino to break off the chase. At 15:19, Lieutenant Commander John Dalyell Stead flew his Fairey Albacore to within 1,000 meters of Vittorio Veneto and put a torpedo into her outer port propeller, flooding some 4,000 tons of water into her hull. His aircraft was shot down moments later, and his entire crew killed, the only British loss of the whole three-day battle. Crippled but still capable of roughly 19 knots, Vittorio Veneto turned for home faster than Cunningham's battleships could follow. A second strike from Formidable between 1936 and 1950 then hit the heavy cruiser Pola, knocking out her power and leaving her dead in the water. Believing his ships faced only further air attack, Iachino ordered Cataneo to send Zara and Fiume with 4 destroyers back to Pola's position to assist her, unaware that Cunningham's battle fleet was closing through the darkness behind them. If a decision this consequential, made in the dark with no radar and no idea a battle line was closing on you, sounds like exactly the kind of turning point this channel exists to dig into, subscribing means you will not miss the next one. Valiant's radar picked up the Italian ships shortly after 2200. Around 2220, Italian lookouts spotted the approaching force but assumed it was friendly. At roughly 2227, the British battle line, Barham, Valiant, and Warspite, closed to 3,800 yards, illuminated the Italian ships with searchlights. One of them worked that night by a young midshipman named Prince Philip of Greece, and opened fire. Warspite's opening salvo alone put 5 15-inch shells into Fiume, setting her ablaze from her bridge to her after-turret. Zara and the destroyer Vittorio Alfieri were engulfed within the same span. The entire action, from first radar contact to the last salvo of the main action, took less than 10 minutes. Fiume sank at 23:30. British destroyers hunted down and sank Alfieri and her sister, Giosuè Carducci, in the darkness that followed. Zara, abandoned and burning, was finished off by a torpedo from HMS Jervis at 2:40 on the 29th. Pola, still powerless where the airstrike had left her hours earlier, was boarded by a British party that took prisoners and captured code material before she too was sunk by torpedo. Italian losses came to 3 heavy cruisers, 2 destroyers, and roughly 2,303 sailors killed, including Cataneo, who went down with Zara, a defeat the naval historian Vincent O'Hara later called Italy's greatest defeat at sea of the entire war. Cunningham's ships rescued around 900 survivors from the water before German air attacks forced them to break off. He then broadcast the position of the remaining survivors to Rome in clear language, allowing the Italian hospital ship Gradisca to recover a further 160 men. Pridham Whipple was knighted for his part in the battle, and decorations followed for officers across the fleet, including Warspite's commanding officer, Captain D.B. Fisher, whose gun crews had fired the opening decisive salvo of the action. Set against the numbers on a specification sheet, the outcome reads almost absurd. A battleship completed in 1915, slower by 6 knots than the ship she had chased and failed to catch that same afternoon, led the action that annihilated 3 enemy warships in less time than it takes to walk a ship's length, end to end, at a cost of 1 aircraft and its 3-man crew across the entire battle. The strategic effect outlasted the night, with 3 heavy cruisers and 2 destroyers gone, and Vittorio Veneto herself nearly lost. The Regia Marina's surface fleet largely withdrew from major offensive operations in the eastern Mediterranean for the remainder of the war, precisely as German forces prepared to invade Greece and, weeks later, Crete. British convoy routes that had been contested waters in March 1941 went effectively unchallenged by Italian capital ships through the campaigns that followed. Matapan also validated almost overnight the case for radar-directed night gunnery, a tactic still viewed with suspicion in much of the pre-war Royal Navy. The action became a reference point studied by British and later American naval planners for the rest of the war. In Rome, the defeat was received as a national humiliation and hardened Mussolini's reluctance to risk his remaining heavy units in the open sea for much of what followed. Warspite herself went on to a further 3 years of frontline service, taking part in the landings at Salerno and Normandy and surviving a German guided bomb hit off Italy in 1943, before ending her career as the most decorated ship in Royal Navy history, with 15 battle honours to her name. None of what happened south of Cape Matapan was written into Warspite's specifications. Her top speed said she could not catch a modern Italian battleship, and she never did. Vittorio Veneto escaped to Taranto under her own power. What her specifications did not capture was a radar set on her sister ship that could find an enemy in total darkness, an admiral willing to stake his fleet on a tactic his own doctrine manuals warned against, and gun crews disciplined enough to put 5 hits into a moving target within seconds of a searchlight snapping open. The Italian cruisers that burned that night were, ship for ship, as modern as anything afloat. The British battleship that led their destruction was a 26-year-old veteran that could not win a straight race against the fleet she helped destroy. At Cape Matapan, the paper specifications belonged to the ships that lost.